6th Sartorial Society event tonight. We're very excited about this one. And thank you so much for joining us. We have not 2, but 3 brilliant papers this evening on the subject of remaking as methodological practice in dress history. This is the last seminar of our first season, in which we have showcased new and innovative research in the historical study of dress, fashion, and bodily adornment. My name is Liz Gernard, and I'm one of the co-organizers of this series, along with Lucy Whitmore, Bethan Bide, Liz Tregenza, and my co-chair for this evening, Serena Dyer. We'd also really like to thank the Passold for their generous support of this series. For a little bit of housekeeping, because tonight's a bit different, we have 3 papers, and we'll have the questions all at the end. Your microphones and cameras are off, but please use the Q&A function of Zoom as we go. Throw in questions as you have them for all of their panelists, and we will ask those questions at the end to our speakers. If you have any issues at all, you can contact us via our email, Sartorial Society Series at gmail.com, or on Twitter, where we will be continuing the conversation. And if you'd like to join the conversation on Twitter, our handle is @Sartorial Series, and the hashtag is #Sartorial Society. There are a lot of S's. We have one very big announcement this evening. Our program for season 2 is now live on our new website, which is sartorialsocietyseries.com. So after a little holiday break, please join us again on January 21st for our first seminar of season 2, which will feature Alison Matthews-David and Kate Strasden and Alden O'Brien talking about life fragments. So please mark your calendars. Think in 2021, great way to start. And finally, as this is our last seminar for the first season, we would like to thank not only all of our fantastic speakers who have shared really wonderful research, but we'd also like to thank all of you, everyone who has participated and asked questions and supported us for making the Sartorial Society series such a success. We can't wait to continue in 2021. So without further ado, Serena is going to introduce our first speaker.
Thank you, Liz. So I am very excited about tonight's range of papers. They very much chime with my own interests, and I'm very excited. So our first speaker tonight is Hilary Davidson. Hilary is very well known for her work on remaking clothing, so an ideal speaker for tonight. And she's currently finishing her PhD at La Trobe, Melbourne, on intersections between dress history and archaeology. Last year, she also published the fabulous Dress in the Age of Jane Austen with Yale. And tonight, she is speaking on the making turn as radical practice, decolonization, feminism, and other voices in dress history. So over to you, Hilary.
Thank you so much, Serena, and the rest of the committee for having me. I'm delighted to be here, and I also want to note that this research was done on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I would like to acknowledge their elders past, present, and emerging. So as I said in the article on which this talk is based, recent years have seen a significant increase in reconstruction approaches across the humanities, and importantly, acceptance of their results within the academy. The value of embodied, experiential, implicit, or tacit knowledges is being incorporated into the study of history, which has seen a number of turns in the last decades. The paradigm has shifted enough recently. We've hit the critical mass of an embodied or making turn around the coming into being of objects and the role of bodies in their making, as well as the innate body knowledge created by the making. Textile and clothing history is predicated on many interconnections of materiality and absence. As museum display reinserts an absent body, close dress historical investigation requires conjecturing or reading absence into incomplete presence. Remaking historic dress engages with material culture absences and produces new garments that tell us about past ones in unique ways. However, remaking dress also has a strong potential as a methodology of radical practice for reconsidering the knowledges of people whose voices have been historically lesser, lessened, or absent in textual records and distribution of socio-cultural validity, especially for women, Black, Indigenous, and people of colour. I'm keenly aware I'm speaking as a very white person, so I'm trying to use First Nation people's words where possible. Reconstructing textile objects can help recognise the skills and cultural values they contain in new, complex, and excitingly challenging ways. In the past, who was civilised and had a voice worth listening to was often coeval with who used words or dressed the right way, who could produce and interpret text to standards expected by dominant society. If we change what is considered a text, then we change how we read and what we read in that text. Recreating dress, then, is a form of textual reconstruction, taking us line by line or stitch by stitch through the production and thinking processes of other people, often of whom nothing else remains. Varieties of remaking historic dress have existed for decades, often connected with the museum and gallery sphere. Dress curators have always added to or substituted fragile or missing objects with replicas, a practice continuing today and seen here. The ability to make replica garments has historically overlapped with the largely female workforce in historic dress and their ability to sew and work with garments in a hands-on way. The feminized spheres of domestic sewing and fashion underpin museum displays and to a large extent are still associated with them. The embodied turn is extending to reconsidering fashion designers' practical cut and construction skills, as with Charles James's Calico historic dress shapes, or the Balenciaga exhibition at the V&A, where patterns and toiles helped demonstrate why the couturier was so great, and Betty Kirk's deconstructions of V&A's works, which have helped deepen appreciation of technical innovation. But overall, the big picture is still about the big names, not the women who sewed in designers' ateliers, whose value largely lay in being so highly skilled as to be invisible. Remaking is a way to help remedy such overlooking. So let's look at the many reasons why people reconstruct dress: to experiment with garments' functionality or substitute a fragile object online or in exhibitions. A replica might fill a gap to make a display complete. It can test process, spinning, weaving, cutting, pattern making, dyeing, embroidery, fit, wear, and everything else that makes a finished object and determines how it works in the social and cultural spheres. There are issues with dress historical reconstruction as a methodology. As yet, there are no clear protocols, principles, or even agreed terminology for the practice of experimenting with material processes in history studies. Each reconstructor tends to find their own way and theory, explicitly or not. There is little theory of knowledge when compared with the thinking about tacit knowledge making in, say, philosophy. What is actually being done, as this range of widely used words to describe the process implies? I now prefer recreation as the catch-all term because I think its sense of the action or process of creating again or in a new way, the result of this process, and a new creation covers the key aspects. There are sort of roughly two main approaches to dress reconstruction. The first is to replicate an object that already exists along a scale of accuracy. This is often easier as the garments exist to be copied, like the pelisse belonging to Jane Austen, it's the real one, that's the replica, that I've now replicated 3 times. The second is to experiment with remaking an object that no longer exists to copy. This might be a garment in a painting or a pattern for clothing or something only surviving textually. Sometimes the two methods can be synthesized to produce new conjectures. So I made this recreation of an 1860 wedding dress based only on one photo as an example of this kind of non-surviving object. Or this 1580 Spanish bodice. But this garment had a secondary value when it intersected with a toile made for conservation purposes of the blackwork jacket I showed earlier. By chance, these two replica objects were put together and the stays made sense of the jacket's cut. They've got different forms, but interacted to create knowledge in new ways. Replicas can be physical avatars, allowing reinterpretations of objects and doing what they cannot. Using makers' hands is recent in the humanities, but has been established for at least 50 years in experimental archaeology, where the structure of scientific experimentation is used to test hypotheses with controlled, recreated outcomes. The phrase experimental archaeology is often co-opted in a historic dress recreation, but is not based in an understanding of the actual guidelines, instead grasping for the nearest concept to express remaking as a research method. Archaeological dress study has thus thrived on excellent reconstruction for longer. Using partial excavated textiles as clothing evidence is more essential the earlier they are, and these remakers are skilled in interpreting absences. However, often these historiographies aren't used so much for periods that are nearer the present. But I don't see why we should shoehorn a social science methodology into history when experimental history is a perfectly valid idea. Having looked up experiment in the OED, it actually has a richer range of meanings to explore and reclaim than the rather narrow scientific usage suggests. I particularly like the embodied experiential dimension of the last two, ones that are well suited to dress. All reconstructed dress is only an interpretation, the action of trying anything, and the point or hypothesis of the making determines the finished object's form. What is being reproduced or tested? In the scientific sense, an experiment must be fully reproducible, but the subjective nature of individual sewing and textiles never can be, so a dress history experiment must necessarily be a different beast. The replica Ostenpalis I make will be different to the one you'd make. Recreation changes the questions asked of objects and certainly changes the answers received. There have long been aspects of textile-based reconstruction in anthropology and ethnography studies also, and new outcomes and recontextualizations found there by remaking. So there's a great example from the influential Hopi Native American designer Ramona Saskiatewa, who in 1983 reconstructed a turkey feather blanket made by the ancestral Pueblo people and came to question the prevailing belief that they had softened the yucca fiber by chewing it. When she tried it, she found the yucca was not only exceedingly bitter, but caused intense diarrhea. And this led her to seek other processing methods. So these kinds of recontextualizations can take many forms. And Sarah Woodyard, once of Colonia Williamsburg's recent MA thesis work of what she calls hand-sewn inquiry and autoethnography into Martha Washington's cap, quote, brought forth bodily connections to 18th century makers, construction techniques of 18th century caps intended for the maintenance of clothing, and a sewing literacy perspective to read the skills of an enslaved seamstress working for Mrs. Washington, as attested in historical documents. Cynthia E. Chin's work on the Materializing Rose project, and I just highlight this relevant event that's coming up in January, includes, quote, recovering the identities of Mount Vernon's enslaved seamstresses, underscoring their lives, labour, and the material products they created. Cynthia is planning to replicate a silk gown owned by Martha Washington that was refashioned by captive labour. So, like the current fashion revolution movement, recreation can be a way of asking who made these clothes, how was this textile produced, and where did the power lie in that manufacture? Beyond the big names, we don't know who nearly all of the clothing in history was made by. Reconstruction helps find out what we can of these often female makers through the material remains of their movements, the embodiment they put into creating dress. So much of the big dress picture is in the small details, like sewing threads, which start to reveal an object biography, when it was made, altered, what's original, what's been added to, and that's just one aspect of clothing's materiality that needs to be analysed for reconstruction. Remaking a garment requires particular strategic looking and recording the details, and often multiple encounters. It's a much closer form of looking because it's encoding information to be reproduced later. You put yourself in the same cognitive space as the unknown maker and try to work backwards from the end results of their movements and decisions. Reconstructed garments can also be tried on, the big taboo in institutional historic clothing, and a practice that creates different kind of embodied knowledges. The increasingly shared experiential understanding of women who wear corsets, historical or modern, is helping to reframe and challenge the frankly unfeminist ideas that the garments were somehow universal instruments of torture and oppression into which women were forced. Bodily experience helps challenge the cultural hydra of the corset myth. The experience of wearing reconstructed clothing also brings insights into the relationship between dress and its shaping of the social self. Wearing can challenge assumptions about dress history based on visual sources and offers other ways to recognize knowledges of the body, whose bodies, what other people thought of those bodies, and how they moved or were used, employed or coerced, what the relationship between clothing, bodies, and making could be or was. This is especially powerful when re-evaluating the experiences of enslaved people, as Cheney McKnight does so well, or those oppressed by the colonization of their country. So in an example of reconstructing something that barely exists, with absences in knowledge filled in by other documentary evidence, Aboriginal people in Australia have been rediscovering the traditions of making possum skin cloaks since 1999. There are only a few known surviving examples of this once widespread and hugely important garment that accompanied people from birth to death. As Mariko Smith says, this is an important cultural practice for my people, the Yuin Nation, as well as for many other mobs. Learning from master cloak makers, mainly women in my community, has been an empowering and healing experience. And Professor McDaniel also makes these traditional garments. As Smith points out, because possums are an endangered species, we have to source the pelts from New Zealand, where they were introduced and are now wild. We are helping our Maori brothers and sisters in caring for country through the humane management of their possum population. So this practice has wider ramifications for supporting Indigenous cultures. She continues, it's also funny that collectors who recorded traditional practices and kept objects as a way to preserve a dying race are now inadvertently contributing to the cultural resurgence movement and in turn the ongoing survival of our people. So we all know instinctively that what you wear changes how you feel, but that's now been scienced. Enclosed cognition quantifies the power of wearing and how having something on your body changes what you know. It literally changes the body, like the way that dressmaking measurably improves people's stereoscopic vision. One of the most moving presentations I've ever heard was from Professor McDaniel talking about presenting an elder of his Wiradjuri nation with a possum skin cloak for the first time and the emotional reaction to wearing this powerful garment. As Gondichuma elder Ivan Cousins says, wearing these recreated garments helps Aboriginal people know who they are and where they come from. And his daughter Vicky, who began the cloak making revival, says the best thing is that every Aboriginal person that tries on a cloak stands proud and tall. They can't not. You're sort of wrapped in your country. That's the feeling. The cloaks conveyed a clothed embodiment Aboriginal people's ancestors knew in the past and which had been lost, but which now affects them bodily and emotionally in the present. Reconstruction creates these new knowledges on many levels. Doing creates deep understanding because practical problems must be solved. If you don't join two seams, a garment won't hold. And making experience further changes how one sees time and labour embodied in historic objects. Having sewn many replicas, these incredible 0.5 millimetre stitches on a Regency shirt now make me reconsider the seamstress's skill, the time, their hand movements, the needle size and thread fineness, and their broader cultural context with awe, frankly. It's a way to access the maker's skills transferred to the body of the object outside any textual discussion. And as when Karen Crocker recreated an American child's mid-19th century dress, for example, until she got down to the stitch level, she didn't allow herself to truly see these garments, including the economical textile use and relative ease and speed involved. Remaking made her reevaluate the style as, quote, a highly practical pattern that even a mediocre seamstress could successfully complete in less than a day. And the hand stitching accommodated the needs of each area on the garment. They were purposefully designed. There was planning behind each stitch, and she gained, quote, a deeper appreciation for the integrity and intelligence of 19th century sewers. Even in recent reassessments of feminine needlework, such as Rosika Parker's agenda setting for subversive stitch, there has still been more of a focus on decorative embroidery, not constructional or plain sewing. This, it is important as female artistic and even intellectual practice, but it perhaps doesn't appreciate what could be termed the precision of the invisible, as Crocker and many others have found. And remaking helps recognise achievements along the full spectrum of thread-based techniques. And one of the difficulties of recreation as a methodology is acquiring these adequate construction skills, let alone those shaped in culturally contingent ways. Not everyone who wants to remake dress can. The work of expert makers, like many people watching and the next two speakers, helps to tap into the skill of expert makers in the past. And Alison Larkin, hello Alison, her outstanding embroidery skills, reconstructed James Cook's waistcoat made by his wife Elizabeth from tarpa cloth, a traditional non-woven bark cloth from Polynesia. And it's a wonderfully Indigenous Western hybrid object, beautifully recreated, that opens discussion about these cultural relationships. Technology is further changing how we encounter and therefore remake clothing, and hence its radical possibilities for reading lost perspectives from objects or seeing them in new ways. A technique as established as X-rays can be reharnessed to investigate structure and reveal what previously only the staymaker saw. In a major project on Tudor knitted caps, Jane Malcolm Davies repurposed photogrammetry, a tool usually used in archaeology to record site topography, to make highly accurate digital replicas with fascinating potentials for future reconstructions of objects. Extending photogrammetry's mapping into augmented reality technology in the Virtual Songlines project places digitally reconstructed artefacts, including textile objects, back into their original landscape and cultural contexts, another step in decolonising material culture studies. The Moskvins do fantastic work digitally remaking clothing. We're working on a digital pelisse. And their trouser reconstructions come from 19th century tailors' publications, but also reproduce their processes. Here they take descriptions of steaming and shaping garments and create a 3D model of how a flat pattern might eventually appear from skilled hands. It's knowledge that once came only from direct making experience. As Smith says of making possum skin cloaks, quote, the sensory experience, as well as the traditional process of learning Indigenous knowledges through the master-apprentice model of teaching and learning, and through processes of trial and error, has really made an impression on me. And this learning hands-on from experts, passing down knowledge, is reflected in institutions dedicated to dress reconstruction that exist now, prominently Colonial Williamsburg in the US and the School of Historical Dress in London. The accessibility and breadth of the internet and digital resources is, I would argue, fairly radical in itself. It provides connections between people interested in remaking dress, the glowing global population of reenactors in particular, who in a sense are conducting experiments, making a network of sharing information via digital communities, generally outside the academy or with varying relationships to it. Often this informal dress history knowledge is highly researched or the only investigation into a certain type of dress. The proliferation of online videos allows anyone with an internet connection to also learn through direct demonstration or looking up objects. I'm alert to the differences between costuming and experimental history here, though they often overlap. So in conclusion, remaking is a specific approach, and I'm not arguing for its universality, not least because the skills are an effort to acquire, but it gives unique insights. The joy of the embodied turn is it encourages people with such embodied knowledge to produce formal research outputs, allowing exploitation of that knowledge in other work, while expanding the range of methodologies for understanding the past. New technologies about old technologies also encourage sharing of informal research outputs and amplify the voices, achievements, and cultures of more people. Inherently interdisciplinary, remaking encourages collaboration and communication and a radical rethinking of what intellectual knowledge is and can be. It helps recognise the skills and agency of those without historical recorded voices, the women, minority, First Nations peoples, whose daily practice resulted in superb quotidian engineering of textiles and clothing. And there are far more examples of this than I could possibly fit into this very brief talk. So, Remaking changes the questions asked of dress history and can provide unexpected answers. And in the coming years, I really look forward to hearing about other emergent or previously lost voices, skills, and perspective found through radical practices of experimental history by recreating dress. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hilary. That was fantastic. And I'm just, yeah, I'm so excited for this panel. Sorry, too enthusiastic. Our next speaker is Carolyn Dowdell, and Carolyn has a PhD from Queen's University in Canada, and she specializes in 18th century women's clothing construction. As well as Carolyn's academic profile, you might be familiar with her from her social media presence as the Modern Mantua Maker. And tonight, Carolyn's paper is titled One Nightgown New Made, a practical investigation of 18th century clothing alteration. And without further ado, hopefully, Carolyn, your slides will magically upload beautifully. So if it takes a minute, we're working on it. And if you just want to unmute yourself as well.
All right, is it looking the way that it's supposed to?
Yep, looks great.
Okay, excellent. Well, thank you so much to the organizers for creating this panel and this whole series. This is amazing, and I'm particularly excited to be part of this panel, which I think is so neat, but I'm just gonna dive right in to my presentation on One Nightgown New Made, a practical investigation of 18th century clothing alteration. Over the course of reading several 18th century women's detailed account books, I repeatedly encountered a few specific phrases or expenditure phrases in relation to clothing, paying for making, having a garment altered, and having a garment, usually a gown, new made. Since all three phrases were usually found in each account book, I surmise they each meant something different. Making and altering are fairly clear, but new made was less so, and I eventually hypothesized it referred to taking apart and significantly remodeling a garment. My talk today chronicles a reproduction project I embarked on in 2018 to explore a particular type of 18th century new making. Oh no, why isn't my slide advancing? Well, shoot. Oh, okay. Okay, sorry about that. My interest in this idea stems from my PhD work on altered 18th century women's clothing, the reason I was reading those account books in the first place. As part of this work, I examined in person and in detail approximately 200 18th century women's gowns in several collections in England and a few in North America. So I got very familiar with different kinds of alterations that were performed. Alterations are ubiquitous among surviving 18th century garments. At least 90% of the gowns I studied were altered in some way at some point in time. Scholars generally acknowledge that 18th century women's clothing was made in such a way as to facilitate later altering and remaking. However, I was keen to identify and understand the specifics of alterations practices and patterns. Through my object research, I discovered that dressmakers at the time, called mantua makers, were actually highly strategic in their approach to sewing clothing to optimally blend efficiency in making and remaking, sturdiness, and neatness. To test this and further my understanding of the alteration process, I undertook an experimental history project, thank you, Hilary, for that phrase, wherein I constructed a 1760s nightgown, a fitted back style, according to the historical methods and techniques I observed on surviving originals. And then I altered that same gown to a 1780s style, also based on original examples. I already had experience making reproduction historical clothing, since my first and still largest project overall was recreating a representative wardrobe of a prosperous mid-18th century woman, including foundation garments, jackets, petticoats, and gowns that you see here, and a riding habit. I undertook this project over 6 months concurrently with my master's studies in 2008 to 2009 at the University of Alberta, to whom I subsequently donated the project as a study aid, since their clothing and textiles collection was largely lacking in original examples of 18th century apparel. After that project, it was some years before I wanted to do 18th century sewing again. But by 2018, I had been making 18th century clothing for myself for a couple of years to play around in places like colonial Williamsburg with some historical costuming friends. 18th century alterations work ran the gamut from basic mending and patching to modifying a garment from one style to another, one type of garment to another, such as a gown into a jacket. I chose this project based on one of the most common alteration types I found on extant 18th century women's gowns. This was a mid-century gown remade into a fourth quarter style. From about 1740 to 1775, most women's gowns were made in a basically consistent manner. So epitomized by the image on the left, bodices were open at the front and filled in with a stomacher. Sleeves were elbow length and finished with ruffled flounces. Skirts were open at the front, revealing a matching petticoat underneath. Hoops were worn under the skirts to hold them out to the sides. Around 1775, there were the beginnings of significant change, including shifting from a stomacher front bodice to a closed front bodice. Skirt volume migrated from the sides towards the back, leading to skirts shifting back and being more tightly pleated to help create a bustle-like effect. Longer sleeves and various styles of fitted sleeve cuffs instead of above the elbow sleeves, and tiers of ruffles. In fact, the majority of surviving women's gowns that I examined that are in styles of circa 1775 to 1795 were in fact altered from earlier gowns, usually made in the 1730s to 1760s. There is a certain degree of survival bias at play here, considering that most of the gowns are silk, and in the late 18th century, cotton was exploding in popularity, so that the majority of new dresses made at the time may have been of cotton that was more likely to be used and reused until deteriorated into rags. However, I still believe that this phenomenon is significant and that an unprecedentedly specific pattern of fashion-related alterations activity was happening 2 decades before the neoclassical high-waisted columnar silhouette emerged. I divided the project into 3 phases. Phase 1 involved constructing a 1760s fitted back gown called a nightgown with a matching petticoat, taking photo documentation of the garments themselves and also styled with hair and accessories appropriate to the period. I then identified that the areas and types of alterations needed to achieve a circa 1780 style based on my object research. Finally, I formulated a list of steps to follow according to my prior making experience and based on my examinations of original altered gowns. Since the focus of this project was the alteration process, I did not document the making of the first version of the gown. However, I used pretty much the same process as for the pale yellow gown that was in my University of Alberta project, and a few others. Phase 2 consisted of performing the actual alterations, doing the work, and then, if applicable, amending the list of steps I formulated beforehand to compare the process I hypothesized with what actually worked. Phase 3 involved photo documentation of the altered gown, 1 set of photos of just the gown itself, and 1 set styled for a date of 1780, like I did with the 1760s version, and finally, collecting my findings. So here we see photos of the gown and petticoat by themselves from the front and the back, the 1760s version. I am wearing the appropriate foundation garments underneath to properly fill out the gown, consisting of shift, stays, pocket hoops, and an under petticoat. Here are front and back photos with styling and accessories of the period, including a wig to simulate the hairstyle, a cap in a style of the period, a lace ruffle called a tucker tucked into the bodice neckline, lacy white sleeve ruffles, and a choker necklace made from a gathered strip of the dress fabric. And yes, it was very fun to wear this, and I was a little sorry that the dress only got to be like this for about a day or two before I actually started altering it. As I mentioned, my hypothesis about alterations came from examining original garments, and a lot of them, up close and in detail. I have collected some examples to show you the kind of evidence I found. I'll show you full-length photos of each gown to give you some overall context. This is a gown at the Museum of London where I did the majority of this research that I believe was originally made in the 1760s and altered sometime around 1775. The front of this bodice shows vertical crease marks that indicate the fabric was once folded back into robings. The fabric of the bodice back has more crease marks indicating the pleats of the en furrow back were narrowed. In this close-up, you can see some of the old pleats a little more clearly. This also means the skirt was unstitched, creating the opportunity to repleat it more tightly as per the later fashion. This gown, also at the Museum of London, looks to have probably been altered for style a couple of times. I believe it was also first made in the 1760s, altered sometime after 1775, and then again in the 1790s when waistlines started to rise towards the high-waisted neoclassical or Regency style. However, for this project, the particular salient detail is the stitched down sleeve head pleats, attempting to create a smoother, more close-fitting look over the shoulders. This sunny gown in the Manchester City Gallery's collection at Platt Hall is yet another made in the 1760s, altered around 1780. It's possible this was originally a sack gown or a robe à la française with the billowing back pleats. For this project, I was very interested in the example of sleeve cuff additions that both change the style of ornamentation and also serve to lengthen the sleeve. You can see that the new cuff was simply laid over the original sleeve end. One of the clues that the sleeve originally had falling cuffs attached is the circular weight. Let me see if, I don't know if you can see my mouse circling the circular weight that's still present inside the sleeve. This was to help the sleeve hang properly when it was only elbow length. These are unnecessary when the sleeve cups the elbow. Interesting that they were just left in there. So taking cues from evidence on extant gowns, the ones I just showed and many others, these are the areas of my 1760s gown I identified for altering. Removing the neckline trim. After trim removal, one of the main changes to make is unfolding the robings underneath to convert the bodice fronts so they meet edge to edge. Because of the way folded robings work, unfolding them actually leaves a gap down the front of the shoulder, so new shoulder straps will need to be created from scrap fabric. Repleating the skirt so the skirts are tighter and all face towards the back of the gown rather than facing towards the side as they initially did. Remove the ruffled falling cuffs and replace them with fitted elbow cupping cuffs. Narrowing of the pleated section of the en furrow back. I'm not going to take you through the whole alterations process, but rather share some illustrative highlights. The first part of the alteration process was unmaking the relevant areas of the gown. I started by removing the trimming from around the neckline and the sleeves. Then I unpicked and unfolded the robings. These are the vertical strips running down the front edges of the bodice that you can see on the far left-hand photo. They were typically created by cutting the bodice fronts larger and folding the fabric back. You can see how much fabric is potentially available for making new fronts. And you can also see the gap at the shoulder resulting from unfolding the robing, which also acted as a sort of shoulder strap. Next, I unpicked the bodice pleats and refolded them into a narrower configuration. This is one of those clever areas of stitching. The pleats were sewn down with tiny back stitches spaced about 1/4 inch apart. This made them subtle in appearance, are sturdier than running stitches, but also still fairly quick to sew and much easier to pick out than a line of dense back stitches. Leaving the tightly backstitched center back seam alone, I reworked the pleats mostly by eye and stitched them back down, again with those tiny spaced back stitches. I unpicked the skirt to change its pleating, and also so I could extend the waist seam as needed from narrowing those en furrow pleats. The waist seam was sewn with small whip stitches, which are also sturdy but easy to pull out, and when executed well, are a visually subtle means of joining an edge to another piece. Actually, cutting into the waist was one of the scariest moments in this process. Once you cut the fabric, you cannot uncut it. This did lead to an interesting discovery, however. You can see by the cutting line that I drew, which you can see in the left-hand photo, that in order to maintain an elegant curve, I had to deepen the back point. This was actually one of the fashion evolutions of the 1780s. Deep back waist points. Since the alteration forces this to happen, I now wonder if the fashion was influenced by the alteration practice. An intriguing thought. I repleated the skirt more tightly and shifted it to sit a little further back on the gown. This will make it actually seem fuller and poofier at the back than it did before. I remounted the skirt to the bodice and then restitched the waistline with small hemming stitches. Here you can see how I pulled the unfolded rovings forwards to create the new bodice fronts. And you can see how the crease marks look similar to those on the original example I showed earlier. I drew out basically on my body where to cut for the new bodice fronts since I was working on myself. In the period, a dressmaker would have been fitting this on her client and would have probably cut it directly. Because the linen lining layer is not folded into rovings like the silk layer, I had to sew an extra piece to make it the same shape as the new fronts. The edges of both layers are then turned in towards each other and sewn with small hemming stitches all the way around the neckline, front edges, and waistline to finish them together. I repleated the sleeve heads to fit the shoulders, then made and mounted new silk shoulder straps from leftover scrap fabric. I then stitched down the pleats in the sleeve head to create the smoother fit over the shoulder. I made new sleeve extensions or cuffs of silk lined with linen. I trimmed them and mounted them to the lower end of the sleeve with a line of stitching, leaving the bottom of the sleeve as it was in a similar manner to the yellow extant gown that I showed earlier. Finally, I added ties and loops to the inside of the skirt so that it could be pulled and puffed up, if wished. So here are the plain photos of the altered gown, front and back, with the skirt strings tied up to create the puffed skirt effect. Again, I am wearing appropriate foundation garments of shift, stays, a false rump this time instead of side hoops, and the under petticoat. You'll notice that I'm not wearing the matching pink silk petticoat here. This is because petticoats were often harvested for their fabric to help perform these alterations and often don't survive. Also, wearing contrasting petticoats had become fashionable. So I took these photos with just the under petticoat to focus on the gown itself. Here are plain photos of the gown front and back with the skirt strings left undone so the skirt hangs straight. And styled photos of the gown front and back with the skirt puffed up. And the styling here includes the fluffy silk organza cap, a hedgehog style wig, a simple ribbon choker necklace, silk voile neckline tucker, a silk voile neckline ruffle, that's the wider one, silk voile, lots of silk voile, sleeve ruffles, and a white silk voile petticoat. Another set of styled photos of the gown from front and back with the skirt hanging loose. So here are some direct comparisons of the plain 1760s and 1780s versions of the gown, and direct comparisons of the styled 1760s and 1780s versions of the gown. So my findings were discovering that the work proceeded, one of my first findings was that the work proceeded more quickly than I anticipated. The entire alteration process took approximately 3 working days to complete, and this was my first time engaging in this specific activity. Period mantua makers would have considerably more experience with it and were thus likely to perform the work in even less time. Earlier gowns lent themselves well to this process, both in terms of construction methods and the volume of fabric within the gowns to facilitate refashioning. The types of stitches and crease marks left from the alterations were consistent with those I observed on extant garments. This further proves that the interpretations of evidence on original objects is accurate. The construction methods used to make garments in the first place were well designed to facilitate unpicking and remaking. They allowed for both fast and uneasy unpicking and efficient remaking. Also, clothing was constructed in component pieces, so it was not necessary to pull the entire gown apart in order to make the changes that I did. I also observed that a very different look could be achieved with a few carefully chosen modifications, which was then enhanced with different accessories that were individually much less costly than a new gown. From the initial making of the gown and petticoat, I had some scraps left over. These were more than enough to provide what I needed to perform the alterations. They would also have been sufficient should more piecing of the bodice fronts be required. The deepening of the back bodice point was a necessary result of the alteration. This also became a style trend of the 1780s, leading me to wonder if this particular alteration may have actually influenced the fashion trend or tendency, which then begs the question, could any other fashion trends have evolved from a similar process? For a while, this was the end of the story. But a year after I completed this project and presented it at a Costume Society of America symposium, I altered this gown yet again to a later 1780s style called a robe à la Turque, a fashion plate of which you can see here on the right. It was a very last-minute decision before heading to Venice, Italy for Carnival with some friends in late February 2019. And by last minute, I mean I made the decision and started cutting about an hour before needing to leave for my flight, egged on by one of my friends that I was traveling with. This alteration went mostly undocumented because of the circumstances, but here's one photo of me working on new sleeves in our palazzo, and a photo of me with some of my traveling companion friends, including my friend Lauren, who egged me on to do this crazily last minute, and my friend Lori, who helped with the process while we were in Venice. So here are a couple of photos of the third version of this gown, taken at a Venice house museum called Carolyn. I made only two major changes. I diagonally cut off part of the bodice fronts and replaced them with mint green incense. I cut the sleeves to a short sleeve length and replaced the lower portions with the contrasting mint green. I added some leftover trim taken from the first version of the gown to trim the short sleeves. And I changed up the style by wearing it with a mint green petticoat that I already had, wearing a frizzed hairstyle. The cap is the same as in the 1780 version, but with extra bits and bobs, and a waist sash with a big bow on the front neckline. Altogether, this again created a very different look with the same gown. Here it is from the back. I wore the same undergarments as for the 1780 version. And here are all three versions side by side so you can see the whole progression. Interestingly, the final alteration had elements of the process that were actually more authentic to the 18th century experience than the formal project was. The gown was a pre-existing garment in my own historical wardrobe by this point. I altered it to a new style to suit my personal preference for the purpose of actually wearing out and about in Venice. It ended up being a collaborative effort between me and a couple of friends who helped me out with it, especially fitting the new bodice pieces. This more accurately mimics the collaborative process between 18th century mantua makers and customers than did my solo performance. I also have no doubt that such a collaboration between friends also periodically happened. And finally, I think it plausible that a comparable progression to this could have happened in the period, given that numerous surviving gowns and other garments bear evidence of being stylistically updated multiple times in a similar pattern. A gown initially made by a mantua maker, then possibly altered by another mantua maker, or possibly at home, could easily have been altered a third time domestically by a woman on her own or with the help of friends keen on experimentation. Altogether, this project enabled me to obtain a deeper haptic understanding of a ubiquitous but murky aspect of everyday life and self-fashioning practiced by innumerable 18th century women, whether professionally or domestically. And now, does anyone know where I can get more of this shot pink silk? Because I really want that 1760s version of the gown back. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Carolyn. It was wonderful, and it's fantastic to see that kind of the life of an object really come to life. We talk about it so much as academics, but it's wonderful to see that process enacted. Can I also just remind all of our attendees that you are very welcome to put your questions into the Q&A as we go along. So if you have any questions from what you've heard from Hilary or from Carolyn so far, then do go ahead and pop them in the Q&A box. So our final speaker tonight is Rebecca Morrison. Rebecca is a PhD candidate with QMUL and the V&A. Her research examines the working life of the English mantua maker during the long 18th century. Prior to this, Rebecca worked as an assistant curator and a historical researcher at Kensington Palace. And this was after a 10-year career as a theatre costume supervisor and maker in the UK and the US. And tonight, Rebecca's paper is titled Remaking Mantuas from Seamstresses to Mantua Makers. Oh, I think you're muted, Rebecca.
Unmute, that would help, wouldn't it? Unmuting. Right, that's the one we want. There we go. And then, oh. Is it working? There we are. Right. So first of all, thank you very much for inviting me, the committee, and it's just very pleased to be in such auspicious company as well, and what fascinating papers we've had so far. So I will crack on. Again, you're going to be hearing more about mantua makers, I'm afraid. It has long been argued by dress historians that the mantua, a style of gown which entered the fashionable women's wardrobes in the late 17th century, was a catalyst for significant change in how women's clothing was worn and how it was made. So this evening I'm going to focus on the latter. I'm going to discuss the debate surrounding the emergence of what was in the late 17th century the new trade of the mantua maker, and how the material evidence from surviving gowns has become the basis for some experimental archaeology carried out in 2 workshops in 2019. So briefly, what was a mantua and why was it revolutionary? And I'm sure many people listening tonight know exactly what it was, but I'll just quickly give you an introduction. Until the late 17th century, it was accepted that male tailors had responsibility for making women's outerwear. This was largely maintained through the protective practices of the guild system. But of course, many women worked with their needle. From legal disputes, we know that wives and daughters of tailors sometimes worked with their husbands and fathers. However, more often than not, when women's employment is discussed, it is as seamstresses. Seamstresses had the right to work with linen and lightweight fabrics such as gauzes in the production of underwear, so shirts and shifts, and accessories, ruffles, collars, caps, etc. And the reason for this distinction becomes clearer when you look at fashionable women's clothing from the mid-17th century. This is just a selection of mantuas, and the mantua as a style goes all the way from the 1670s through to being a court dress, and it dies out at the beginning of the 19th century as a court dress, but the last one here dates to about 1780. So this is what came before. This is known as the silver tissue dress, which is at the collection of the Fashion Museum in Bath, and is so named because of its sumptuous fabric. It dates to about 1660 and is not in fact a dress as we would think of it, but rather a bodice and coordinating skirt. The bodice is lined with linen, encasing extensive boning and a piece of stiff brown paper or parchment, which has been added for reinforcement at the centre back. It is a garment that was both complex and time-consuming to produce. The mantua, in contrast, was a loose, unstructured gown, which in its simplest form could be described as a T-shape. According to Randall Holm, the author of the Academy of Armoury, which was published in 1688, it was a kind of loose garment without and stiff bodies under them, and was a great fashion for women in the year 1676. Now, this is probably the oldest extant mantua and belongs to Lady Clapham. Now, Lady Clapham, as you can see, is a doll, and she's in the collection at the V&A. She stands about 56 centimetres or 22 inches high, and she dates to the 1690s. She owns 2 ensembles, an informal nightgown and a petticoat, and a more formal mantua and a petticoat. What is lovely about Lady Clapham and her husband, Lord Clapham, is that they give a real sense of how these clothes were worn. And here you can see that her mantua is worn loose over separate stays. Now, separate stays were not necessarily new, but when worn as part of a formal outfit, this is when it becomes quite innovative. So, back to why it has been argued that seamstresses took over from tailors in the construction of this garment. For this, I will return briefly to Randall Holm. Not only did he describe the mantua, but he also listed it amongst items made by both the tailor and by the seamster, i.e. the seamstress. He also went on to state, very often the seamster occupieth the room and place of a tailor in furnishing the nobility and gentry with such conveniences as serve the whole body, especially for the summer season. Now, this has been interpreted by dress historians, including Madeline Ginsberg, Janet Arnold, and Avril Hart, as proof that female seamstresses had taken over from men in the construction of the garment. Lynn Sorge English nuances this by suggesting that it only happened when tailors were overworked, then further rationalizes that the change from male to female might have been so gradual that it was never recorded. The logical conclusion, therefore, is that for a while at least, the tailors and the seamstresses worked in parallel in the construction of mantuas. Certainly, there is evidence that the trade was not strictly gendered before the end of the 17th century. In June 1696, a classified ad was published by a genteel man, about 30, bred up a mantua maker, who desires to serve some gentleman or other as a butler or any way without livery. To have reached 30 but trained as a mantua maker would imply that this man started his apprenticeship or training in the early 1680s, but perhaps he now considers it a woman's trade which did not suit his masculine independence, as suggested by his desire not to wear livery. Certainly, if we look across the Channel, similar patterns of production had already appeared. A small number of French seamstresses had been admitted to the Tailors' Guild in Aix-en-Provence in 1652, but the defining moment came with the incorporation of their own guilds in Paris and Rouen in 1675. After this date, seamstresses in numerous towns and cities across France joined tailors' guilds as subordinate members. These women were collectively known as couturiers. As Claire Crowston discussed, the term couturier had come into use in medieval times to describe a woman who sewed either professionally or for private purposes. With the growth of women's participation in the trade and their attainment of guild privileges in 1675, couturier acquired stricter professional and gender connotations. In 1680, Richelieu defined the term as she who earns her living sewing linen or cloth, and in 1694, the Académie Française concluded that the couturier was defined as a woman who works in sewing either linen or dresses, who makes women's and children's dresses. And although by the mid-18th century the term was inextricably linked to the guild whose primary statutory responsibility was for women and children's outer garments, these earlier definitions also reveal the connection to women who worked with linens. So far, few dissenting voices. However, Elizabeth Sanderson, in her work on Scottish mantua makers, argues that their social background suggests that they were not seamstresses, but rather came from professional or middling families. This is an interesting suggestion because certainly by the mid-18th century, trade directories reckoned it a genteel as well as profitable employ. And there was a cross-section of girls entering the trade. There were both parish apprentices and those who could afford premiums of £30 to £40 being taken on by mistresses. And few women in early modern England did not know how to sew. It was one of the skills a girl would be taught, usually by her mother. Sanderson also raises the interesting question of how did Scottish mantua makers learn to make the new mantuas? She concludes that some must have travelled to London and brought back mantuas, which they unpicked, going on to add that using made-up garments in the absence of a paper pattern was a natural thing to do. However, if we take this one step further, how did any mantua maker learn to make this new style of gown? Wouldn't the simplest solution be to work with what you know? And this is where it becomes confusing, because the same historians that suggested mantua making evolved from the practices employed by seamstresses also suggested that much of the gown was achieved by draping and shaping the fabric on the client's body. Here's some nice quotes for you. This practice would have been completely alien to seamstresses who laid their pattern flat on the fabric. And I'm using the word pattern carefully because unlike today, when a contemporary dressmaker would use a paper shape laid on the fabric and cut out, this was not an option for early modern seamstresses. Firstly, paper was extremely costly and the amounts required would be prohibitive. But secondly, and more importantly, they did not need a paper pattern. As Susan North states, an early modern seamstress's pattern was a geometrical division of the linen into the required pieces for a shift or shirt. So what does this mean? If we take a look at a layout for an early modern shift, you can see how two garments can be cut extremely economically using only simple divisions of the fabric, again courtesy of Susan North. So this image shows that the image on the left shows how to cut out two women's shifts. As you can see, there are two pieces that use the full width of the fabric, and they're the front of the shift. They're narrow at the shoulder and flare out towards the bottom. And then above which there are two vertical rectangles that are the body, the back of the shift. And then the green triangles are the gauze which would go at the back to create the flared shape. And the grey shaded areas of the wavy lines are the sleeves. And then next to that, you can see how the shift is made up. So the front is C and the back is D. The two purple squares are the arm gussets. So there's squares on the left, and once they go into the shift, they become triangles. And the grey sleeves have blue wristbands or cuffs at the end. and those are taken from the shift's neck here. So you can see just how little fabric is wasted. So not only can you see the economical, how economical the seamstress was with her linen, but also how a pattern can be created by folding or drawing lines on the fabric using simple divisions that can be done without mathematical calculations. The important thing to remember is always to start with the correct width of fabric. So how do we get from this, which is a doll shift of the 1690s, to this? So these three mantras all date from 1705 to 1710 and are all constructed from very similar patterns. And many of you will be familiar with the pattern of the Aquilate Hall mantua. It was published by Janet Arnold in Patterns of Fashion 1 as the Clive House mantua. Clive House has now disappeared, so it's been renamed. So that's her pattern. When you look at it on the page, it conforms to the conventions of Arnold's pattern taking practices. However, it does not look very similar to the drawing I've just shown you of the shift. So I decided to try and devise an experiment which could possibly link the ways of working between early modern seamstresses and early modern mantua makers. The idea arose during a zero waste workshop at the School of Historical Dress led by Jenny Tiramani. During one exercise, the students were asked to work out the most fabric efficient way of cutting the pieces for a shift using different widths of linen. So you were given the image on the left of the 4 shifts, and then you had to work out how to cut them out. And this is taken from Garceau's Art de la Lingère. For me, this exercise highlighted the similarities between shifts and the pattern pieces of early mantras, which then led me to examine more closely whether early mantua makers would have approached cutting gowns in the same manner as shirts and shifts, and whether this could explain how they took over the production of gowns. And in turn, it would also illustrate that stylistic changes in the early gowns went hand in hand with the developing skills of the mantua makers. So 2 workshops were organised, and both ran along very similar lines. The first was at Rose Bruford College of Theatre and Performance on the 3rd of May 2019, and was integrated into the Costume Production and Theatre Design BA courses. The first workshop was devised with the help of Veronica Isaac, who led the students' lectures on the history of dress. Because few of the students were familiar with early modern and 18th century garments, the day started with a talk on historical methods of cutting and stitching. I also challenged the students with some practical exercises, including Jenny Tiramani's shift cutting challenge. A similar format was followed at the second workshop, held at Uppsala University in Sweden on the 26th of September 2019, with the help of Cecilia Anir, who leads the textile history course there. The students were largely former MA textile history students, several of whom who've gone on to work as tailors or dressmakers in the theatre or reenactment industries in Sweden. Again, I gave a talk on historical methods of cutting and stitching, and I challenged them with the Garceau shift patterns. But I also included an exercise during which the participants traced Arnold's pattern of the Aquilate Hall mantua, and using the tracing paper and sticky tape, they worked out how the pieces fitted together. Before the workshop, I'd also made up a copy of the mantua in calico, so they had a physical example to examine. And these were both things that the students at Rose Bruford had noted would have been helpful for them. At both workshops, the participants were divided into 4 groups. Each group comprised a mantua maker, 1 or 2 journeywomen, and a client. So group 1 was draping. This group draped their mantua using techniques also known as cutting on the stand or moulage. The client acted as a life dress stand. Group 2 drafted. This group drafted the pattern directly onto the cloth using a technique similar to those employed by seamstresses on linen. Group 3 could use a combination of draping and drafting, and they could decide in which areas of the gown they should be employed. And then group 4 was given a published pattern, and so this group was asked to work from Arnold's pattern of the Clive House mantua. The first 3 groups were supplied with 18 yards of half-earned, which is 21-inch wide calico. The length was decided upon by evidence from early mercers and mantua makers' bills. These groups were permitted to use cotton tape, which they could mark for measurements, a yardstick, pencils, pens, and pins, but no modern tape measures or graph paper or anything like that. The 4th group was given 9 meters of 150 centimeter wide calico and was allowed any modern pattern drafting equipment they wished to use. They could use grading papers, curves, rulers, standard tape measures, whatever they wanted. All the groups were supplied with a copy of the Janet Arnold pattern and images of mantuas from 1690 to 1720 for reference. And participants at Uppsala could also examine the mantua I had made before the workshop. Each client required an appropriate set of stays. Now, these came from Rose Bruford, so they were theatrical stays. They weren't quite period appropriate, but they did the job. At Rose Bruford, all 4 groups worked in the college costumes workshops and used tables that were either configured to be long and narrow or shorter but wider. At Uppsala, the group configured the tables as they wished and worked either in the drawing studio or in 2 other spaces where sewing machines were provided. Now, sewing machines, I hear you cry. At this point, I would like to take a moment to consider what these workshops were investigating and how, despite not using authentic, and I use that word under advisement, materials, they still fall within the parameters of the experimental archaeology or embodied practice as so eloquently laid out by Hilary Davidson earlier and in her article on the embodied turn. The hypothesis tested was the practice of cutting. The intention was not to make a replica of a particular item of clothing, but rather to question the various ways in which a maker could reach the same outcome and therefore try to establish the most likely technique employed. As Arnold explained, reproductions range from the use of a single layer of calico simply to test the assembly of pattern shapes to commissioning hand-woven silk satin dyed with weld for a gown lined with linen and stitched with silk and linen thread in order to understand more fully the tailor's techniques. It would have been lovely to have used hand-woven silk, but not necessary to achieve the aims of the workshop. Time was limited, therefore sewing machines were permitted, as these did not impact on how the gowns would be cut. If the workshop could have run for another half a day, that would have been interesting. However, I suspect that the mantuas would still not have been finished. Rather, the participants would have worked more slowly. So, how did my contestants do in this great historic sewing bee? So at Rose Bruford, this was them. This is the students at Uppsala working through the afternoon. We've got several groups here. Okay, but these are the students at Rose Bruford. As you can see, no one finished their mantua, and despite being permitted to sew on the sewing machine. Group 2, I've put them in order. So that's 1, 2, 3, and 4. So this is draping, drafting, combination, and modern techniques. So, or using Janet Arnold's pattern. So group 2, which drafted the pattern on the flat, were arguably the most successful, although they did use draping to finish the garment on the model, so they use a bit of a combination. Of all the groups, they were the one who took the most time thinking through the task before attempting it. All the groups found working with unfamiliar methods and styles a challenge, and it took time for the students to adjust from a modern mindset. But as they gained confidence and pace, they learned to do this. And how about Uppsala? The results were similar, but having worked on some of the problems highlighted at Rose Bruford, such as the limited amount of time for thinking and planning and the lack of a physical example, the mantuas were quite a bit closer to being finished. Again, the group limited to drafting, again I put them in draping, drafting, combination, Janet Arnold, came closest to completing. Also, this group chose not to use the sewing machines and instead sewed their gown by hand. However, they did make the petticoat using sellotape. Some of the feedback was particularly enlightening. So Emma Frost, who acted as mantua maker for this group, explained how they managed to make the back pleats without draping. We thought about where the side seam would go, measured approximately a palm width from the selvage of the fabric because it felt right. We took a waist measure, decided how wide the pleats on the back would be, and marked it on the waistline on the back. We marked the width of the pleats on the top of the back and marked where they wanted to have the pleats on the front, and that was it. They found that they could make the mantua without draping. They did have a couple of thoughts of how to speed up the process, including leaving the centre back seam until later. In this way, 2 people could work on the garment, one on each half, more easily. But again, this would prevent the maker from draping the fabric. Interestingly, the draping group struggled with the side panels, but found if they sewed 3 lengths of fabric together and then cut them diagonally, so these are the side panels of these bits in here, this not only worked but was quick. However, it wasn't draping. Using this method, I think the drapers could have reached a similar level of finish as the drafting group. Sadly for them, they had lost one of their members during mid-afternoon, so there were only 2 of them making the gown. The group that struggled most in both workshops were those working with Janet Arnold's pattern. Joanna Gulbach, one of the Uppsala participants, explained her experience. I was the mantua maker in the group that only used modern methods. We enlarged Janet Arnold's pattern on the fabric, cut and sewed, pinned together. It was very tedious to measure all the pleats, from the scaled pattern to the full-size pattern, which made it very apparent that this was not the best method, unless perhaps the purpose was to make an exact replica of an existing garment. And this comes from somebody who is a professional pattern maker in the fashion industry. So what can we conclude from all this? Firstly, it is possible to make a simple mantua without draping the pleats on the body or stand. In fact, it can be quicker not to do so, especially if you don't sew up the centre back seam. Draping the pleats does also work, but you do need to draft the side gauze, and the most likely way of doing this is by using a technique which would have been familiar to seamstresses. Although the final gown would need to be fitted on the client, having exact measurements is not essential. The pleats of these early mantuas fall free down the back in much the same way as the pleats of the sack do. However, unlike the sack, they are then held in place by a ribbon or cord tied around the waist. The pleats only started to be stitched down when bodice lining is introduced in about the 1720s or 30s, and this coincides with the introduction of pattern matching down the centre back, and arguably shows the developing skills and changing techniques of the mantua makers. This can also be seen in the introduction of separate sleeves and shoulder seams. Therefore, fashion is following technical innovations. In so many other forms of manufacture, glass, ceramics, silverware, it is accepted that technical innovations are often the drivers for change. So why can we not think of dress in the same way? The two workshops have not only confirmed my suspicion that early mantua makers employed techniques familiar to seamstresses, but also that it was the seamstresses' embodied knowledge and understanding of how simple shapes could be manipulated, folded, or even measured by the palm of a hand, which allowed a simple T-shaped garment to be the catalyst for a seismic shift in the production of women's clothing. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. All three panels were absolutely fantastic and worked really nicely together. So lots of overlaps, lots of synchronization, which is great. I'm going to jump right in because we've got some really good questions and I don't want to hog the question time. So I'm going to start initially by asking about class. And I think as two of our panels, focused on quite elite forms of dress, and Hilary, you were a bit broader. I was just wondering, the question is there a reason, and I think we can broaden this out from just one specific speaker, but is there a reason to focus on specific class garments and specific, genres, essentially, whether it's materials or any other sort of ramifications? So if that's my opening question. Thinking about class.
Survival bias. I mean, that's a basic one. We study more of what there is more of to study, which is why, I mean, I think, it's interesting sort of looking at archaeological pieces, genuinely archaeological pieces, because they're often incomplete and partial. But I think, now we're also part of this, the turns that we're going to is finding the rare pieces of working class clothing even more interesting. It's like, oh yeah, another elite dress, but look, we've got like one thing from underrepresented groups. So yeah, I think sort of practicality would be one thing, but there's also a correspondingly greater interest in those pieces that are rarer, that were previously less considered or valued.
I'd also add in with styles like the mantua, although it went up into elite society, and the examples that I showed are largely court dress. It was also worn throughout all levels of society, but we don't have any examples that survive. And what has been kept are the beautiful silks, and there's one wool one, which is a complete outlier because it's made completely differently. But so although what we see in museums and books and things are the sort of beautiful elite pieces, there were very similar items that were worn lower down in society, but just made from slightly different textiles.
Yeah, that's one of the sort of given acknowledged wisdom is that, you know, for the 18th century, particularly, that the clothing styles were pretty consistent across classes. It was a lot of the time the fabric, the textile that was used that differentiated. I mean, that's a generalization, but that's sort of the overall.
Yeah. And there was also a food chain. So something might start at the top and then be gifted and then be sold and then be stolen and, and patched and mended, and it kind of works its way down. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think that's something that often comes back at you know, people that do this recreation, is why you're only doing the higher class stuff. So yes, there's definitely reasons behind that bias. So we have a really interesting question about scale. So the reproductions and the recreations that all three of you make tend to be at full scale. I wonder if you could reflect on whether you think that anything is lost if you worked at half or quarter scale, and whether that would help us to speed up this process, or whether that would help us to prioritize remaking over the kind of embodied experience of wearing the garments.
Well, again, I would say, I think that just depends on what why you're remaking things. There's a fantastic project online that's been archived called the Alsager Project, where a reenactor in Australia remade the entirety of Alsager's 1580 costume book in half scale, because he was testing the patterns in calico. So that was really good for the purposes of his reconstructions and what he was doing and why it was behind. I would say also, the thing is, when you do it on a smaller scale, the fabric drapes differently. So that can sometimes be a reason to choose not to do it. But again, it depends on why you're approaching this remaking, and what purpose is for that, perhaps would be why you choose to scale something.
I'm also not sure it's always that much quicker either, because you're still a similar amount of work and same number of pieces, and it's smaller, so it's fiddly, you know. I mean, it's cheaper. You have to buy less fabric, but
yeah.
Great. We've got a question about writing. So to switch a little bit, this is for all the presenters again. How do you approach the writing up of your remaking practices and transform the tacit or embodied knowledge you generate into academic work that is also accessible to non-makers? Are there any non-traditional means of presenting your work that you found really effective alongside academic writing? Hard question. Think about it.
So far, everything is feeding into my PhD, which is as I have to present in a very traditional way. So I try and make it as accessible as I can, but that's not something I've had to really worry about too much, but perhaps for the future it's something that I should think about.
Maybe I should have. So when I did this project, it was specifically for presenting at the 2018 Costume Society of America Symposium. And the way that I presented this project, I didn't give a talk about it. It was, they had this sort of like small exhibition space, and that's where this project was presented. So I had one of those sort of, like foldy poster board things. It was a big poster board going through the whole process of it. And then I actually also brought the gown with me, and I displayed it. I didn't display it on a mannequin. I didn't mount it intentionally. I had it sort of, lying on the table, and the different pieces that kind of went with it, so that people who came to the exhibition could pick it up and look through it if they wanted to. So I guess that's the closest I've come to that.
Regarding the writing, I found it really helpful, especially when things are being peer reviewed. So in the proper academic process, when they're peer reviewed by someone who doesn't sew, because then they go, what does this mean? Or what does that mean? Or I don't quite understand. And then I go, oh yeah, okay, I see why, that needs to clarify. So I find that kind of running it by a non-audience, again, because you get so close to it, sometimes you forget what language people have to talk about this. And in the sense of kind of non-traditional approaches. I always found it really great whenever I talk about Jane Austen's Police, I bring a replica of the Police, and people can try it on and can engage with it in a different way. And it's like, I always feel like it's sort of throwing open history to them. It's like, no, you can play with it, you can touch this one. And that just elicits like really interesting responses. Plus I found a body double for the Police. And, you know, I once tried it on a descendant of one of Jane Austen's relatives, and they had exactly the same arm length. Like everyone says, oh, these arms are too long. And she was like, I've got really long arms, let me try this. So you can kind of, just by having the thing there as this avatar to play with, like Carolyn says, it just gives a completely different way of encountering what you're talking about for people that I think they really respond to, but that's hard to do in writing.
I'm going to take this opportunity to ask a question which isn't from our Q&A, but which I want to ask, because it fits in quite nicely, which is, I think, Hilary, you touched upon this in your paper, and obviously, Carolyn, you're a bit of an expert in what I'm about to ask. There's so much kind of knowledge about historic making processes and methods and practices, which is created outside of the academy, which is created in the historical costuming community, and we're seeing more and more of it become accessible through things like Costube, which those who don't know, it's costuming that's on YouTube. And I wondered if any of you had any thoughts about how we can capture that knowledge that's being generated and make it part of the kind of the current academic conversations that we're having.
I've been wrestling with that thought for years. I don't have a good answer yet. I'm sorry. I'm still working on it. Yeah, I mean, I'd really like to try and publish this particular project as an article, so that'll be sort of an experiment in how to translate it over. I mean, I guess like sometimes I've toyed with the idea of, because I sort of bridged the two worlds, should I be somebody who's like doing, like, should I be writing about, you know, this phenomenon, since I kind of participate in it also? So, but I haven't done that yet. And so, yeah, I'm sorry, I don't have a really good, I'd love for someone else to tell me how to do this. Because it's something that I've thought about, but I don't have a solution yet.
I completely agree, Carolyn. And sometimes I feel like just acknowledging it exists is actually something that helps, to not see it as something other, but go, here is the practices, to look at this spectrum of the way things are doing. And, you know, I'm a dress historian because I started in reenactment. So I always kind of feel this like, no, there's, you know, aware of this breadth of possibility. But I think being inclusive and having multiple conversations, and, you know, even I wonder if things like these sort of online events that open up to everybody in new ways, that aren't, you know, art conference, are also going to help shift the thinking. But I agree with you, I don't know how either, and I've thought about it a lot.
I absolutely agree, and I also think it can go both ways. I think we need to sort of take the academy out, but we also need to bring the other side in, and get sort of people on the sort of academic side. Some of people already are very accepting of these sorts of practices, but I'd quite happily kind of give them 12 yards of fabric and a needle and thread and say, go for your life, you know, and see how they find it. I think, you know, it's sort of it's interesting dialogue to have on both sides, I think.
I can relate, because I'm one of the less inclined less inclined. I'm working on it. It's a goal. It's going to happen at some point. But no, I really appreciate that back and forth, especially because I feel like, at least for me, it completely changes how I look at objects when I look at them in store, of that realization of, oh, that's what that seam does, or, you know, those kind of really small details, which I don't think you appreciate when, or often it's really baffling when when you start out looking at historic dress and have no idea how that sleeve was cut, you know. But that's more of a personal reflection than question. So I'm going to ask a few specific questions, or there are a few specific questions, so I don't want to leave those out. This is one for Carolyn. As you mentioned, the changing fashions may have been a result of the alteration practices, I wonder whether the fashion for coordinating petticoats, as opposed to petticoats from the same textile of the gown, is simply because petticoats were used for those alterations. So I guess this is, sourcing and practicality.
Yeah, that's actually a thought that I literally had while I was practicing this presentation for some friends like yesterday. But I decided, you know what, I haven't had a chance to like think about this yet, so I'm not going to put it in, for today, but just sort of very kind of obliquely suggested by saying, well, if it's possible that these deeper waists were influenced by the necessity of cutting those narrower back pleats, maybe other things are too. And the petticoats, the contrasting petticoats, was one of the things that I thought about, that, it's kind of like bling, that would be potentially logical. That, yeah, if you're cutting up a petticoat to use it for other things, or like you can't have it as your petticoat anymore, you have to wear something else with it if you're going to keep wearing the gown. So that, I have no evidence. This is purely speculation. It's just sort of, it seems like it's potentially logical. Like with the changed waist seam, I don't have any period evidence or like documentary evidence that suggests that, yes, this is what's going on. It's a result of realizing this has to happen. So is there a connection here? And I'm just starting to think about these things, and that's definitely something that would be an interesting direction to go, is to see if there's a way to marry up find something that seems more like real evidence to suggest that, yes, this is maybe what was going on, or this was perhaps a factor.
So we've also got some more theoretical questions. So this one is specifically directed at Hilary. So your model of remaking seems to posit an ideal relationship between an original lost garment and a recreated modern garment. What about the deep space in between? Art historians have explored this as a space of translation, transformation, and reinterpretation. So could art historical theories of translation inform the experimental remaking of material garments that you discuss?
I'm not quite sure what the question means by translation in this point.
Okay.
Sorry.
I guess that's one of the issues with having this as a Q&A, because obviously it's harder for the question asker to clarify their meaning. But I guess that part of what is being asked here is, that this is a process of translation. We are taking something from the past and we are reinterpreting it in our own ways, as you do discuss.
Yeah.
And I guess maybe what the question asker, is that right now, is asking is, how do we kind of mediate that process of translation? How do we kind of think about that theoretically?
I mean, the thing is that I definitely don't posit that there's an ideal model. In fact, quite the opposite. I think there's a spectrum, and there is always a spectrum, and I'm interested in that spectrum. And I think that spectrum changes from the doing. And in that sense, I would say that art historical theory, on which dress history is kind of based, is dress history is kind of about thing, text, image. So it comes in that way that we use images throughout dress history as ways of, all sorts of relationships between, the garment as it might have been and then the image, and all of those kind of layers of interpretation and nuance on there. So I think it's certainly been incorporated as part of one of these kind of, I always think of them as the three pillars of dress history. So yeah, I think that there's a lot of potential for art history methodology that has, been brought in too. I think, it's the possibilities for the new combinations of that information and those interpretations and translations, which is, thank you for that phrase. Actually, I'm going to think about that, about the notion of translation and text too, to work with each other. And a text and an object can have a different relationship and conversation, as it were, than an image and an object. And I feel that it's about, you know, that sort of the great sea of research and how we pull what we find into remaking or whatever methodology it is that we're using in all sorts of different ways. So yeah, I think I'd say, sorry, I'm thinking my feet here. I'd say there's definitely possibility for it, and in many cases it is brought in as part of a kind of a larger exploration. And in a sense, it's what hasn't been come up with yet that I find almost more exciting than what we have come up with yet. So if people can find new methodologies and in other areas to bring in and kind of have that theoretical conversation, then fantastic. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, no. It definitely does. Thank you. I'm sorry, we've got so many good questions and it's really hard to choose them. I apologize. I'm going to ask another one. Nope, we've asked the one about scale, but I guess this is really specific, so I'm going to ask it anyways. This is for Rebecca because it's about the dolls, and we all love the dolls. Are there any surprises either in the construction or the style of the Mantua dolls' clothes? I'm assuming they mean the Clapham dolls. Sorry, the Chapman doll. You know what I mean.
Yeah.
You're not seen in surviving full-scale costumes.
So I think they think they're a few years earlier than any other museum Mantuas. There are two that could potentially also be 1690s, one in Sweden and the one in the Met called the Kimberley Mantua, which is the wool one. And the Kimberley one is, the wool is a much wider width than the silk and is made completely differently. So that's why I said before it's an outlier, you know. And also some 20th century conservation put modern lining in the bodice, so you can't see how it's made now. So although I looked at it, I didn't look at it terribly closely, but matching the pattern that Nora Waugh took off that, it is very similar to the Swedish one. I'm going a little off topic here, but the Swedish, at this point, the Swedes their clothes were still being made by tailors. They followed more of a Germanic trend. So I've always wondered if the Kimberley Mantua was made by a tailor, which is why it's different. Now, the Clapham dolls, her mantua is very similar to the three I showed you, the Acrylate Hall Mantua, the Rom, and the Met's other mantua. And the way that they're constructed, they have the sort of sleeve head is actually, it's a T-shaped garment. There isn't a set in the sleeve, and there's a seam here with a sort of an extension to create the rest of the sleeve and the cuff. The only big there are two differences with the Claphams. The first one is obviously because it's so small, they haven't gone to the lengths of replicating silk widths. So you have less pieces in it. They can make the mantua using less pieces. So the seams are slightly different in that sense. And the other difference with the surviving ones is that there is a lining, at least in part, so that when it was turned back over the hips or at the cuffs, you saw the pale pink silk lining underneath. I think the Met one, which is that beautiful kind of corally pink, I think that had a lining because the petticoat is still lined, and there are places where the way the stitching is done, it's slightly the wrong way round, but it would be the right way round if there had been a lining there. So I think the Clapham mantua is a great example because it does, you know, it looks very similar to ones that we know were around about 10-15 years later. And it is slightly different from her nightgown, which I didn't show you. So there was at that point slight differences and at that point a nightgown was more like an informal wrapping gown than the nightgown that Carolyn was talking about. There are so many different names for gowns which are all pretty much the same in the 18th century that it gets very confusing. Anyway, I hope that answers the question.
We usually end at about 7:30, but we've still got quite a few questions. So are you happy to answer a couple more before we wrap up? Yeah. Okay, so we've got a question about, this is for Carolyn. about kind of the relationship between the 18th century and the 19th century. So we've seen something go from the 1760s, 1780s, and even 1790s. But do you see evidence of alterations that takes this across that gap and through into the early 19th century?
Yes. Oh, absolutely. Yes. There are, you don't see as, in terms of what survives, I didn't see as many gowns that were altered from, say, like the mid 18th century to the early 19th century, although it did still happen. And there are some very interesting examples where sometimes it seems like somebody was trying to make it work and it didn't quite, and they kind of abandoned it partway through, or they've got some odd quirks to them that you kind of scratch your head about, like, why did you do that? But yeah, you absolutely do. And you see, I think you see a little bit more of gowns that, like, especially like cotton gowns that were made in after 1775, so like in the 1780s and the early 1790s, getting altered for the late 1790s and into the early 19th century, and a lot of times just by like taking the skirt off and shifting it up on the bodice, and you've still got the original longer bodice surviving on the inside, which is always fun to find. So that does, I mean, cloth, even though it was getting more affordable, was still the big investment compared with labor. So you would keep using these textiles again and again. And even into, like, you know, I've encountered dresses that were altered to wear in the 1830s. I've seen ones that were altered to wear and like to wear as a dress in the 1830s, and into, you know, a little bit later as well. And I remember Hilary and I actually looking at a riding habit at the Museum of London's collection and realizing that, oh, the petticoat that's with this is actually not the original one. It's like an 1850s petticoat. So this riding habit jacket was obviously worn again to wear as, it seems, as clothing in the 1850s. And then that's not to mention the whole huge thing about the Victorians loving to wear 18th century dresses as fancy dress and messing around with them. But they're not wearing them as clothing, then they are actually wearing them as costume. So it's a different type of phenomenon. But yes, I mean, it just, you know, you just keep using these things. You just keep using these textiles again and again.
Great, thank you, Carolyn. I'm actually going to jump off something you said about labor. So we focused, labor's been a really nice thing that's sort of interwoven throughout all of your talks. And we have a question about if we can talk more about the hierarchies, and I think we are leaning towards, we're doing gender bias, and I'm okay with that. We're leaning towards hierarchies of women. Sorry, tailors, we'll get to you. Yeah. But we have a question about, could you say, and I think we can, you know, broaden this out. I know, Rebecca, this is your world right now. But also we broaden it out. Can we talk about more about the hierarchies of women in the field of dressmaking? For instance, were women who traveled less respected? Are there any famous, well-known examples of women in this field? I guess broadly, if a little insight into that world would be wonderful, if that makes sense. Not having you to do your entire PhD in a.
Yeah, this is the other thing. I think there's always been this sort of notion that you have milliners who, because you needed a lot of money to set yourself up as a milliner, that they were probably at the top of the tree, and potentially you could make the most money as a milliner. Mantua makers sat somewhere underneath that, because again there's always been this notion that they had to be quite genteel because their work was working with clients and you had to know how to behave, as well as how to sew and how to make beautiful clothes. There are names that pop up. There are obviously mantua makers that were popular, but on the whole people don't tend to to name them explicitly. I know of one or two. There's one at the moment I'm writing about, but she worked in theatre rather than kind of elite fashion. And she's right at the end of the century. She kind of goes over into the 19th. That's for my long 18th century. At that end comes in. But even then, the women that she was making costumes for on the stage never once named her, as far as I can find, in any of their memoirs or letters or anything. And she was obviously very well known. So I think, especially for mantua makers and anyone further down, so once you kind of get into sort of provincial makers or seamstresses, and and then obviously there's a ready to wear market and the slops market and all that sort of thing, it becomes even more anonymous. And I think this is sort of one of the problems, that it's like, today if you popped into M&S to buy a t-shirt or a pair of pajamas or something, you wouldn't really mention that you went to M&S. You might do right now because the shops aren't always open, but on a normal day-to-day basis you wouldn't. And I think that's one of the problems. We sort of forget that this is how pretty much everyone had their clothes made. And so it was a normal occurrence, and it wasn't really something worth talking about. And also, if you had a good maker, you kept it to yourself. You didn't share it around.
That's what I found up into the Regency period as well. And I want to mention Jenny Batchelor at Kent is doing a lot of research into the named dressmakers in the ladies' magazines. If you're familiar with them, if you read La Belle Assemblée or things like that, there's always, this is to be had exclusively of Mrs. Bell of this, and there's this kind of like advertorial element of certain dressmakers, and she's starting to kind of look into who these women actually were, where they sat. And I think that's quite interesting, because it's a period where we start to get kind of dressmaking advertising, but then how popular were those women actually compared with, as you say, that the great maker that you have an intense relationship with but you don't necessarily share. And I think that would be really interesting to see what comes up with Jenny's research into that, as this kind of more of a print advertising of skills in the early 19th century.
Yeah, I mean, there were women in the sort of the third quarter of the 18th century who were advertising in the newspapers quite regularly, but I haven't really found much more information about them. I know what they sell because they list all the things they sell, and I know some of their prices, and I know their addresses, but above and beyond that, I don't know their backgrounds, who they apprenticed, who they were apprentices to, how much, it's all gone. It's like no one actually kept it.
You sort of wonder, if they have to advertise, does that mean, like, are the really good ones the ones you never hear about? And so
yeah, I do wonder if in a sense they were the dressmakers that people who'd just fallen off the stagecoach in London went to, because they hadn't built up that network yet of, because a couple of them do advertise courtwear, and you do wonder if the sort of the new sort of gentry coming in from the countryside who don't know where to go start looking in the newspapers for tips.
Yeah, it's really fascinating, especially as from my own research looking at consumers, you do sometimes see these networks where the customers that went to a particular milliner rather than mantua maker are friends and do know each other and actually talk about that fact. It's interesting that seems to happen for milliners, but maybe doesn't happen for mantua makers, and if that is potentially a differentiation. So I think that we've pushed our luck far enough. We should let people go and have their dinner. So I think that's all that we have time for tonight. So thank you for your wonderful questions, everybody that came, and for 3 wonderful papers from our speakers. And I'm sure that these papers might have inspired some of you to pick up your needles over the winter break. So, as Liz mentioned at the start, our new programme is now live on the website with our new URL, sartorialsocietyseries.com. So do go and have a look at the programme that we have lined up for the new year and the exciting papers that we have coming up. So thank you all for coming, not just tonight, but over the last 6 events as well, and for showing such support for the Sartorial Society. We, and I'm sure all of our speakers, really do appreciate it. When we started the Sartorial Society, we did really want it to be this very friendly, inclusive, kind and supportive space, and we are so pleased that that sort of has been what's happened, and we're really proud of that, and that's all thanks to you as well as all of our speakers. So I'll end by wishing you all a very happy Hanukkah, a Merry Christmas and a restful winter break, and we'll see you all in the new year.